Welcome to Generation Reinvention. Today, baby boomers are revolutionizing business, marketing, and consumerism. They are shaping popular culture. They are changing the meaning of aging, and they are inventing the future. As host Brent Green searches for signposts of significant economic and social change, leading experts bring their unique ideas into dynamic discussions. You'll discover possibilities for personal reinvention as well as business creation. Some choose to see only problems with boomer aging. These compelling interviews bring you closer to extraordinary opportunities. Here is the host of Generation Reinvention, Brent Green.
Welcome back to Generation Reinvention. I'm your host, Brent Green, and we're going to continue our travels around the world in this program. You know, boomers across Asia represent a lucrative market opportunity. In fact, the Asia-Pacific region is ready for amazing growth in the 50-plus population. We can expect that the 50-plus spending power will hit the $2 trillion mark by about 2015. In fact, this segment is growing 5 times faster than overall population growth. Asian boomers are not the same as their Western counterparts, and even among Asians, they differ greatly. The one thing they have in common is their relative wealth and the time to spend it. Global brand marketers must understand that aging can create self-defining interest groups, but so too can ethnicities or countries of origin. There's much for us to learn, and we have the right person with us today. Our guest this time is Kim Walker, founder and CEO of Silver, based in Singapore, the first strategic business and marketing consultancy in the Asia Pacific focused on boomers and 50-plus consumers. Before founding Silver, Kim has held local and regional C-suite positions in Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, and Tokyo. He is an ad industry veteran with a global perspective, and he is the #1 expert in the Asia Pacific region. So I'd like to welcome Kim Walker to the show. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, thanks, Brent, and I'm flattered by the introduction.
It's a delight to have you with us. And just for the benefit of our listeners, it is now approximately 5 p.m. in Denver when we're recording this show, Denver, Colorado, and it is 8 a.m. the following day in Singapore. So I'm drinking my beer, and I'm just kidding, and Kim is drinking his coffee, but together we're going to talk about the same thing. So let's begin our program taking a look at the 50-plus market in the Asia-Pacific region, Kim. And so for the benefit of our listeners, beyond what I already said, how do you define the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I guess obviously the Asia-Pacific region extends all the way from Japan right through to, I actually include India and down to Australia, New Zealand. So it's a massive area, both in terms of size and in terms of population. You know, we've got some huge economies, and in terms of the 50-plus segment, as I define it, we have got some of the largest, the fastest growing, and the oldest societies on the planet. Obviously, you have Japan as one of the oldest societies in the world. You've got some of the fastest growing aging communities in places like China, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and of course the size of places like China, where the population of people over the age of 50 is approaching the entire population size of the United States now.
That is a remarkable statistic. More 50-plus people are in China than populate the entire U.S. continent, or the U.S. country.
Yep.
That's a fascinating perception. So what's it like? You know, they sometimes said that someday, like around 2030, the U.S. is going to look a lot like Florida across the entire nation. Is that what it's like in the Asia Pacific? Do you have this kind of sense of aging as you look around, as you walk around, as you live and work in the areas in which you live and work?
The variations between a country like Australia with the Anglo-Saxon culture and Japan And China, on the other hand, and India, on the other hand, these are very, very, very old and established cultures, and therefore very, very different. They have extremely different ancient histories and modern histories that all influence their current behavior and so forth. So very difficult to use the one-size-fits-all philosophy.
Sure.
But I mean, if you go to a place like Japan, for example, quite clearly you see the aging issue. I mean, it's palpable. Australia, perhaps somewhat less so, because I guess being an Australian myself, we like to think of ourselves as being sporty, outgoing, and vibrant. And even the more mature elements of the public will be quite active and quite sporty and spirited. So it's not quite the same as you would see in Japan. Elsewhere around the region, I mean, India has one of the youngest age profiles in the world, so it's a total contrast there. I think 2/3 of the population under the age of 30 or something to that effect. So you certainly don't see the aging issue in that market at all. So as I say, I mean, it just varies so much from country to country, which is what makes this region fascinating. As I said, some of the fastest growing aging populations, some of the oldest populations, and the more dynamic ones. So, you can get on a plane and do a tour of the region, and you'll find extremely different 50-plus marketing situations facing you from day to day.
Therefore, we need an expert leading the charge. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, you noticed that the 50-plus market was somewhat being ignored by brand advertisers. In fact, I think you had somewhat of a personal experience that turned the silver on in your mind. And what was that? What happened to you that made you move into this particular arena?
Well, I looked in the mirror. I think the thing about this is that I'm as guilty as the next person. I've been in the marketing communications industry all my career, and living in all the countries that you mentioned before, and obsessed with youth like everybody else. And at the time, I was running the Asia Pacific operations for one of the large global advertising agency groups, and I had 13 offices across Asia Pacific to manage. And I was needing to install new management in some of these offices. And so what I did is I contacted some of my old buddies, and old in the context of the advertising industry is anyone over the age of 40.
Yes.
But I actually went to a couple of old friends that were, in their 50s, and one in one case he was 60 plus, and installed them as CEOs in a couple of the different countries. And I just thought I'd hit on a secret that everyone else had ignored. Here I had these fabulous, talented people who had enormous experience, enormous maturity, and sensitivity in their markets, and they had a Rolodex full of potential customers. So I guess that started me thinking, saying, there's a lot of value in the mature managers. And then I started to think of that in the context of consumers. And so in my sort of little bit of research, I came across a quote from the United Nations World Population Aging Report, I think 2007, and it said, "Population aging is unprecedented, a process without parallel in the history of humanity." Now, there are not many occasions where a body like the United Nations will make a statement as definitive as that. And I'm thinking, a process without parallel in the history of humanity. So if that's the case, if there is no precedent, then no wonder companies, businesses, societies, people are having difficulty dealing with this rapid aging issue. This sounded like a bit of a calling for me, and so I decided to set up a business to go after it.
But, part of the purpose of this program is to focus a little bit on what's going to be happening with respect to the boomer generation, which I'm sure you know as well as anybody the definition of in the U.S. Is there a boomer in APAC? And I'm sure that's a two-part answer, because there are many different countries represented by that region of the world. But is there something we can call the boomer in your part of the world?
Not as clearly or definitively as you certainly can in the Western markets, like in the United States, the UK. I think, I would divide the countries in the Asia-Pacific region into the developed versus the developing, and those that were under strong Western influence, or the colonies. If we look at the developed former colonies like Hong Kong, Singapore, things that were, even during the immediate post-war years, under the influence or management, if you like, of colonial powers, naturally they were absorbing a lot of those cultural influences, the music and the sorts of things that have shaped the boomer generation in the Western developed markets. On the other hand, China, of course, is completely the opposite. The post-war situation in China is quite different, because they went straight into a cultural revolution,
Sure.
which probably defines their generation more than a Second World War baby boomer kind of influence. So
Yes.
with China, you kind of have to almost put that one to one side, because of the dramatic and devastating effects of the Cultural Revolution. But in the same way, there are definite generational influences that have affected them because of that history.
Okay. Well, I see your point there. And those perhaps in the more westernized regions, such as certainly Australia and perhaps Japan, did you sense a baby boom with the kind of cultural implications of that meaning emerge into the 60s and 70s?
Japanese consumers became the greatest consumers of recorded music in the world, and the reason for that was quite simple. It was the tour of the Beatles in 1965. Now, that's the sort of thing that it illustrates the impact of Western culture in a country as kind of unusual and unique as Japan. But if you turn the clock forward, when the people who were jumping up and down and screaming when the Beatles arrived in 65, they are now reaching retirement. So what are they doing with their time? And it's not surprising now to see that in Japan, I think in 2003, one of the hottest selling items, particularly among the 50-plus group, was an electric guitar.
Interesting. Well, I remember my first contact with Japan in kind of a personal way was when I got my first transistor radio. And, that, as we know, dovetailed the emergence of the Beatles and rock and roll music and so forth, and changed everything. So now we had our own little personal music systems to carry around with us, which have now been dramatically updated in the form of the iPod and MP3 music players and so forth. Well, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to take a lot deeper look at the meaning of the 50-plus aging phenomenon in the Asia-Pacific area with arguably the world's #1 expert in that topic. So stick around. We'll be right back.